today we are actually ending our series. We're going to do a deep dive in what is considered by scholars to be the last sign or miracle recorded in the Gospel of John, and that is raising Lazarus from the dead. Okay, so like I said, he details this in 41 verses. This week, I will repeat my teaching method a little bit like I did last week. I do a step-by-step through the story as it progresses. So is anybody here not heard or read this story? Okay, so this will be good and new for you. Okay, so love it. Most of us have heard this, so hopefully I'm going to give a little more insight into what you already know or learn something new. Okay, so let's dive in. Verse 1. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Okay, so it was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So here we have our main characters, siblings, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. The same sisters who we read about hosting Jesus at their home when Martha complained, Mary's not pulling her weight, Mary's not doing this, right? Okay, siblings, typical, right? This is the same Mary and Martha that we're talking about. Now, when Jesus came to Bethany, their house was actually a home away from home. He visited them often. And Martha was a great cook from the stories that we hear. Mary was a great listener, as we know, her to be the one who agitated Martha because she was sitting doing nothing at the feet of Jesus. Okay, I won't go into that story. I could, but I won't. I paint this picture because Jesus was not simply acquainted with this family. Okay, he did life with these people. All right, he hung out at their place for some respite and relief and restoration and probably some laughter as well. Okay, Jesus loved these people so much so that Mary emphasized that personal love when she sent the message to Jesus that Lazarus was sick. Verse 3, she says, so the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. Now notice that's it. There is no request made here. They felt this love of Jesus would be motivation enough to provoke an assumed response of healing. An assumption was made, right? Lazarus and our desire for his life should be way more than all these other strangers that Jesus is healing, right? Kind of the tone behind what they're saying. That was seemingly the manipulative tone that this was written with, okay? I'm not saying that, that's scholars saying that, okay? Verse 4, but when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It's for the glory of God so that the Son of God may be glorified through it, okay? We see the big picture. We know what's coming at the end, okay? Big surprise, he dies and he comes to life, right? We know that. But they didn't know that at the moment. So at this moment, it kind of feels like Jesus is dismissing it, right? Like a wave of the hand, and repeated what he said about the blind beggar, right? The man born blind. This isn't what you think. It's about glorifying the Son of God. Move along. Move along. Be off with you. Now think about the messenger who delivered this extremely important message to Jesus. I imagine he's like, so what am I supposed to say? Do you have a message for me to go back with? Does he go back with a message? We don't know. We don't know what sure he sent back saying. But John explains in verse 5 and 6 that Jesus will add to this comment a lesson on true love. Okay, so this is about Jesus being the Son of God, right? But he adds to that. He says, but now John explains in verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. I know we're step by stepping this, but we have to stop there and realize what just happened. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. John didn't say Jesus loved them or that Jesus was love. John purposely mentioned each of them, Martha, her sister, and Lazarus as individuals. He didn't merely love the family, he loved each of them with a specific love and understanding of their personality, their personal relationship with him. Insight number 1. The love of God is individualized and personalized for each of us. The same that he spoke of here about Martha and her sister and Lazarus is true for us. He loves us where we are at. So we have the sisters speaking of love of Jesus and Jesus speaking of love of them. But understand there are 2 different translations of love at work here. So in the sister's plea, the one you love is the Greek word phileo, which means friendship love or fondness. But the word John uses to describe the love of Jesus for Mary, Martha, and Lazarus is agapao. And by definition, this love is a divine and unconditional, incessant, and sacrificial love with no ending. Insight 2. It's easy to incorrectly define God's love through the lens of human understanding. Isn't that what the sisters did? They defined his love as this, but Jesus says, no, this is how I love them, okay? They say, the one you're fond of, the one you're friendly with is sick. But John says, Jesus loved them divinely and with each individual's attitude and personality and perception in mind. And as we read this story, we will see this love play out uniquely for each of them, especially Mary and Martha, very personally. But before we go there, look at the transition between verse 5 and 6. It reads as one sentence, one continual flowing thought. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place he was at. Let me put it simply. He loved them, therefore he decided not to come for 2 more days on purpose. His love, by its nature, necessitates sacrifice for the sake of a higher objective. Because of that love, he delayed. He didn't deny, but he delayed. Wrap your head around that. He wasn't busy. He wasn't sidetracked. He didn't get distracted by anything. Because of his love, he made a choice to not rush to an urgent situation. You see, Mary and Martha were equating the love of Jesus with action. Jesus was saying, there is so much more to my love than what I can do. It's who I am. And that drives my intentions for each person who confesses me as Lord. Insight number 3, God isn't manipulated or moved to act based on our discomfort. Don't we want him to, though? Lazarus was in a lot of discomfort. Question: will we choose to see Jesus's delayed responses or seemingly inaction as love? Can we look through the definition of Jesus's love, a sacrificial love? Can we remember he isn't just a friend that is fond of us? He's sovereign Lord, and he operates out of that love as Lord. In other words, Jesus might as well say, it isn't about you, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, Teresa, everybody in this room. Because of love, it has to be about me. But that doesn't mean he doesn't care. Okay? Let's read on, verses 7 through 10. Then after those 2 days, he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you are going there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not with him. If I were those disciples, I'd like, stop talking in poetry. Can you just use words, please? But the disciples here express that Jesus is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, to put plainly, for wanting to go back to Judea. That was dangerous. It was a dangerous space for them to return to. Not just for Jesus, but for the disciples too. Because, as we remember, the religious leaders still wanted him dead. And that desire was not lessening with time or Jesus's absence, okay? As a response to their warning, Jesus talks about the 12 hours, not stumbling. This is the same concept of what he has said before with the blind beggar, right? Put simply, one scholar put it this way: Jesus still had work to do. The 12 hours were figurative, speaking of the time allotted by God for his earthly work. Insight 4. Jesus was always in the hand of the Father, not man. In other words, Jesus wasn't going to die on accident because somebody got to him before God did. His time was projected, and he lived without fear, trusting in that truth. It made me think. Here's a question. Do I believe God created me, sent me with a design, time, and purpose? Psalm 139:16 says he did. It says, you saw me before I was born. It says, every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. Doesn't that say that we were created and sent with a design, time, and purpose? Shouldn't that advise us how we approach every single day, each circumstance, just like it did for Jesus? Once again, that's 139 of Psalm, verse 16. I know you're going to want to go back and reread that. So let's move on. Verse 11 and 12 and 13. After saying these things, he said to them, he said to his disciples, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant he was taking rest in sleep. Jesus says he's asleep. The disciples push back and he goes, well, shouldn't he sleep so he'll get better? We shouldn't wake him up. Again, knuckleheads, right? And of course, maybe we would be the knuckleheads too, doing the same thing, but we have the bigger picture. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. I mean, there's some compassion there. Like, he could have gone, guys, come on. And verse 15, Lazarus has died, and for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Verse 16, so Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Okay, first of all, how unloving does Jesus sound? If the disciples don't get what he means when he says Lazarus is asleep, how do you think they're going to interpret the fact that Jesus says, I wasn't there and I'm glad. He's dead and I'm glad, right? I'm glad I wasn't there to save him. Now add to that, which is very interesting to me that John included this. And if you know Chuck Missler and some of his studies, you know that everything is in the scripture by design and on purpose. And everything has something for us to learn. So add to that conversation, Thomas. He mentions Thomas here. Thomas is the infamous disciple known as the doubter, right? But honestly, doesn't he just say what most people are thinking? Knowing that they want to kill Jesus, he says, well, we may as well go so we can die with him too. Now, notice though that Thomas was referred to as the twin. Why? Because he literally physically was said to look like Jesus. That put him at special risk. Can you think? I mean, if somebody's after Tiffany, I don't want to look like Tiffany, right? Not that I would have your back, trust me, it's okay. But think about that. He had a special reason to go, okay, fine, I guess we're going to die. because they're probably going to come after me before you because I look like you. But scholars often reference that this fact, maybe when you look closely at Thomas, isn't just about a twin being with Jesus. It's about a twin that mirrors us today. Think about that. Scholars say maybe Thomas mirrors our own humanity. Honestly, most people don't want to admit that they have doubts or have doubted like Thomas and actually said it out loud, right? We don't want to admit that we question like Thomas is known for doing. Most people won't say it out loud like Thomas did, but is thinking it any different than speaking it the way Thomas did? It's still in the heart. If he didn't get it, he was known to say it. Okay? I thought that was fascinating. Because if you want to mirror Thomas, you have to mirror the fact that he also had an utter cry of loyal despair at this moment. If I die, so be it. There's loyalty there. That's something that we can mirror. So question, can we mirror the loyalty of Thomas in every one of our personal circumstances, no matter what the outcome looks like? If I die, I will still go with you. If it doesn't work out, so be it. If things don't go as planned, I will still have no regrets for saying yes to obeying Jesus. That's what Thomas is saying there. He may be a doubter, but he was all in. So let's move on. We know Jesus had planned on going all along, but he delayed. And most likely, due to the time frame, Lazarus probably died either right before that message reached him from the sisters or shortly after. But he needed those extra days before traveling to Bethany to offer the most incredible outcome of a miracle of all. We're going to watch a YouTube video here in just a second as Dave gets it ready. But have you ever watched an artist throw paint at canvas? Cup full here, bucket full here, and it looks like nothing. Splotches, chaotic splotches of paint everywhere. But as you wait and you watch the hands of the inventor, the creator, this amazing portrait comes to life. That's what was happening with the disciples going back to Judea. That is what's happening with Mary and Martha. So at this point, the disciples and the siblings are looking at all the chaos of the situation. But Jesus has a masterpiece in mind. And the vision, this vision of the Father, is what made Jesus say, and I am glad. Okay? So, verse 17. Now, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Verse 18, Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So Jesus shows up and we are 4 days into the funeral. Many from Jerusalem had gathered around to support Mary and Martha, but due to the warm environment of that day, and there's no embalming process for the dead were buried immediately upon being pronounced dead. So they are all in this intense state of grief. And for the Jews at this time, this intense state of grief lasted about 7 days of a mourning process. And that 7 days, a Jew would not shave, they wouldn't shower, they wouldn't do anything but exist as an expression of their grief. And their grief is very publicly displayed. I know I've been to a lot of funerals. I know a lot of you have too. And at my dad's funeral, this was especially true. It was held at a funeral home. It was quiet. It was somber, almost eerie. Like I felt like I was supposed to act dead in the process of being here because it was like faux pas if you make too much noise or a baby cries even. It was irritating to the people that were just there for that somber moment. By the way, when I die, that's not the kind of service I want. Okay, so I want stand-up comedy at my memorial service, please. There you go. You'll bring a grilled cheeses maker. I love it. No, my favorite quote, side note, is laughter through tears is my favorite emotion from Still Magnolias. So should anybody be moved to tears when I pass away, there better be a reason to laugh at my service. There you go. I digress. Okay. Unlike a somber and quiet environment, the Jewish funeral was very demonstrative. And it was a demonstration of how much you love that person by how loud you grieved. They would rip their clothes, they wailed and they groaned, they threw things around. And if you couldn't muster up enough energy for such an expression of sorrow, they would hire professional mourners to keep it going. Because that's how much you had to express your grief. We're so different today, aren't we? It's like, don't show them crying. Stop. Okay, but understand why Jesus arrives on the fourth day and not sooner. So in this process for a Jew, this 7-day process, the most devastating part of their grief was at the end of the third day and the beginning of the fourth. See, Jews had this superstitious belief that the spirit of the newly deceased person hovered over the tomb for 3 days with hopes of re-entering the body. By fourth day, decomposition was so far along, it was no longer desirable for the spirit, and the spirit would finally disappear and leave. So they were waiting these 3 days, thinking it could still happen. It could still happen. Jesus shows his face at this moment when their hope of that happening is truly gone. Verse 20. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him. But Mary remained seated in the house, probably because she was still displaying her grief of immobility at that point. Somebody else was expressing her sorrow for her. Verse 21, Martha, going to Jesus, said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Martha, in her emotional state, full on confronts Jesus. If you were here, I expected you. If you had intervened, if you had shown up, she's having an honest outpouring. Yet it's a statement of faith nonetheless. She knew, she had faith that if he had been there, her brother would have been saved. But I love what she says next, and this is powerful. Verse 22, after saying, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Now, most people think, oh, she thinks thinks Jesus is going to resurrect Lazarus. That's not what she's thinking. What she was saying is that even now in my grief, I will trust that you are Lord. I don't like it. I'm frustrated, but I still have faith. Even now, you will be my peace. Even now, you will be my hope. Even now, you will be my comfort. Because she left all the other family, all the other friends who had traveled to comfort her, to be with the one that even now could provide her emotional needs. Jesus said to her, verse 23, your brother will rise again. This is how we know that that's not what she was expecting, okay? He says, your brother will rise again. And Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. So Martha assumes that Jesus is falling back on Hebrew theology and that the righteous will arise again on the last day, okay? That was what her assumption was. So she wasn't saying even now you can do something about Lazarus, okay? She says, I know that, Jesus. Have you ever heard similar words? Like, this is what we hear today. Well, at least you know you'll see them again someday. That's what she's equating what Jesus is saying, okay? And we smile through the ridiculousness of that in our grief that is supposed to make us feel better. It's truth, great, but it doesn't always make us feel better. This is how Martha is interpreting those words of Jesus. But then, after she says, I know that he will rise again on the resurrection, Jesus makes an I am statement here. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And Everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Now, understand at this point, Martha understands resurrection to be an event that they are awaiting. Jesus is saying, no, not someday, but right now. Jesus is assigning resurrection to himself as a person. In other words, what he is saying here is wherever I am, I bring life. In my presence, there is life to the dead things in your own heart and mind. See, Lazarus wasn't the only death that Martha had experienced here. There was a death in her desire for his healing, right? A death in her dream of a future with her brother. He was not only speaking of salvation as we know here. I could do a whole message on salvation based on these two verses alone, but I think we all understand that's why Jesus came. So I want to dig a little deeper into things that maybe might not be talked about. He was not only speaking of salvation and resurrection about Lazarus or the end days, he was personalizing it for her situation, for her right now. Insight number 5 is what scholars said, and I gave you all of this because it's so good. Scholars say, based on this, we all have a Lazarus within us. A disappointment, a dream fizzled, a wound deeply buried, or a death of what has been, could have been, or may never be. Resurrection by way of Jesus offers life to all things dead or dying within us. That is what Jesus is talking about here. That is what Jesus is referencing. And he looks at her and in the eye and says, do you believe, Martha? Do you in this room believe? Question. Do you believe even now that Jesus can breathe life and resurrection into your personal heart and mind and soul? Even now. What if you're even now? See, he didn't ask Martha if she understood it. He only asked if she believed, and she said, yes, I believe you are the Messiah. And at that moment, it's at that moment that she said, yes, I believe you are the Son, the coming God, the Son of God. It's at that moment that something changed in Martha. It catapulted her into a new emotional state of being, but not because she thought Jesus would resurrect Lazarus. It's because Jesus had resurrected something within her. Just like the disciples couldn't see the story past the chaos of Jesus walking into what seemed to be a death sentence to go back to Judea, Martha didn't have the next chapter of the story. And I say next chapter of the story very literally. Now go back to read verse 2 with me again. Oddly enough, John volunteers this information. Verse 2, it was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. That hasn't happened yet. That happens in chapter 12. After Lazarus is brought back from the dead is when this occurrence with Mary wiping the feet with perfume happens. But John writes about Jesus once again hanging out at their home in verse 12. After this happens, John writes about Jesus hanging out in their home. Martha's going to be serving food to Jesus. And it says that Lazarus was the one of those reclining with Jesus at the table. This is a story that has not yet happened. This is a story that Martha does not yet know. Martha didn't see what was next, but she still believed. And it's this next chapter that Mary poured out this expensive perfume and wiped the feet of Jesus with her hair, a very significant posture of worship. So why did John allude to this? Well, I love how one scholar explained it, and I'm going to quote him. And he said, why did John include this at that point? He said, because the attitude of worship in every situation is a lesson that John wants us to understand. And what we will see is that attitude of worship is what we see consistently in Mary. She sat at the feet of Jesus when Martha was working. After this, she will be worshiping in her posture before Jesus by pouring out this expensive fume. But nonetheless, that is her attitude as she addresses and comes into her presence with Jesus here. So let's back up a little. So when Martha had said this, she went and called her sister. Remember, Mary is seated at the house. And it says she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you. Now keep that attitude and posture of worship in your mind for a second. So Martha was most likely private, trying to do this privately in hopes that Mary would have an uninterrupted moment with Jesus, right? Before all the crowds noticed that he was there. And I'm not going to go into grave details on this, but one scholar mentioned it, and it's important to notice that John used the term, the teacher. The teacher is here calling for you, as the way Martha referred to Jesus, okay? This is a side note, but the rabbis in that day refused to instruct women. They weren't allowed to call rabbis teachers because they did not get taught by the rabbis. Jesus didn't hold that belief. Martha said, the teacher, the one that has taught us. Okay, sidetrack, let's move on. Attitude of worship, Mary. That's who she is, right? Verse 29. And when Mary heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Verse 32, now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Immediately in the presence of Jesus, in the midst of her grief, Mary falls back on her normal posture before Jesus. She falls to her knees out of worship. This is her nature. This is how people saw her. They saw her as one who worshiped Jesus. When life was calm, she worshiped Jesus. She worshiped him during dinner. When life was broken, she still chooses that same position, that same posture. Martha ran to Jesus for the comfort that no other people could give her. Mary ran to Jesus as she knew him to be the safest place where she could be. And she repeats what Martha had already said. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Most likely they had said these words to each other in their tears and in the newness of their grief as they're conversing. And we don't know the tone of these identical phrases spoken by each one, but one thing is for sure, there's a difference in their posture. Martha stood, scholars say, probably arms crossed, expressing honestly while still stifling through her emotions of everything. Jesus, this is what I feel. If you were here, Lazarus would have been here. But what I should say is even now I will worship you. There was a process there. After all, Jesus had to call her to belief, right? Mary's response was to immediately worship. She fell first. The words may have been coming out of her mouth as she said it, but she was on her way to her knees. Both expressed their personal sorrow and both received a positive response of love from Jesus. But insight 6, Mary's posture before Jesus came before her prayer to Jesus. Does ours? That's a powerful picture. Do we posture ourselves before we pray? However, despite those differences, both were invited by Jesus to draw closer. Martha, in her belief, draw closer to me. Do you believe? But let's look how Jesus draws close to Mary. verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. So once again, John is emphasizing that Jesus sees Mary specifically weeping. And we talked about sees, same thing here. She's discerning clearly the heart of Mary, a personal encounter. And he was deeply moved and greatly troubled. Now, the original version uses the words that Jesus groaned in the spirit. This is important because the original Greek phrase literally means the snorting of a horse. When it says he groaned in the spirit, it's referring to the snorting of a horse that is angry. You know what that's like, I'm sure, right? And it is only used in the New Testament when referencing a strong rebuke or scolding. Basically, what John is saying is Jesus is angry. But at what? He's angry at death, point blank. He's observing at this moment what never should have been a part of life. He came down from heaven because people are experiencing these things in life that was never created or designed. He's groaning over a fallen world led by a fallen angel, and he is agitated. One scholar says he feels a sense of indignation at the havoc that the enemy and sin has poured out upon these mourners, because death should not be. Verse 34, and he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jew says, see how he loved him? But some of them said, could not he have opened the eyes of the blind man, also have kept this man from dying? So notice here, this is where Jesus invited Mary to really draw close. She says, where have you laid him? He says, where have you laid him? Mary, will you take me to the darkest part of your heart right now? Isn't that a question Jesus asks of all of us, though? Teresa, where have you laid the deepest wound? Where is the darkest space that hurts the most? Where's the place that you would rather others not see because it isn't attractive at all? In the moment he sees that destructive place, Jesus weeps, connects with Mary. Remember, he didn't have to come to Bethany. He's Jesus. He chose to come close at their darkest hour. God is saying, take me to the place of emotion that you won't let anyone else go, where the dream seems final, where the death seems absolute. Take me to the depth of your pain. And Jesus weeps with Mary, weeps with the mourners. The words Jesus wept, obviously, we know are the shortest verse in the Bible, right? It was said that I read that Spurgeon, my favorite, Charles Spurgeon, wrote 2 full messages on these 2 words alone. And I'm looking to try to find them because I want to know. But here I did find a quote from him, and it says, Jesus wept. These aren't words that you read. They are an encounter that you should feel. Why? Because insight number 7, you never cry alone. Question, when was the last time you cried? Can you picture Jesus crying with you? Have you ever thought about the fact that Jesus is crying, shedding tears with you? The next time you cry, invite Jesus and his compassion to sit there with you in it. Okay, Mary wept. The crowd wept. Jesus wept. But understand, John uses here 2 different Greek words for weep. The weeping of the sisters in the crowds is defined as the wailing, the sobbing in grief, like we talked about. It's an audible outpouring of groaning and yelling. But the Greek word for the tears of Jesus indicated a quiet weeping or shedding of tears. So Jesus stands in silence. Tears swell up. They start to roll down his cheeks. And one scholar said Jesus was greatly moved, but Jesus was never out of control. A testament that though fully God, he was also fully human, as Hebrews talks about a high priest who was relatable and empathetic. And this was so important. This is a side note. I don't have this here, but I have to say it because I learned it. In that day and age, Jews were influenced by the Greek culture, and Greeks believed that God, whether it was their God or whatever, had no emotions. So for the Son of God to be expressing this emotion was something powerful to them. So verse 3:6, so the Jews said, repeating this, see how he loved him? But some of them said, could not he open the eyes of the blind man? Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Third time we hear this, right? Third time that this is said. He healed outsiders, but does nothing for someone he loves. Once again, man is trying to define what love of God should look like. But I love what Charles Spurgeon says in response to the Jews saying this. He says, this what if Jesus had been here? This what if talking is vain, of no use. Perhaps the bitterest griefs that men know come not from facts, but from things which might have been. As they imagine, that is to say, they dig wells of presumptions and drink the salty waters of regret. I love what he says. Their grief wasn't necessarily about the facts. It was about their imagination of what if. 3 times this what if scenario is mentioned in this miracle. Maybe John says they are focusing on the wrong what if. Instead of what if he had shown up, we should change it to what if he still does? And what if we're not looking and we don't see it? So verse 38, then Jesus, deeply moved again. Scholars say this is his divine power working itself up. Like I pictured it when I was reading the scholars talk about this as Thor. I love the Avengers. Thor, swinging the hammer, getting ready to launch. That's kind of what is happening here in the emotions of Jesus. He's deeply moved again. Those emotions, that anger, that passion, that compassion is all coming to a head here. So Jesus, deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone laid against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor. King James Version says, it must stinketh, Lord. For he had been dead for 4 days. Remember, there's no embalming, there's no protection from any of that, and it's hot where they're at. Verse 40, Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? In other words, Martha, stop playing the what if game. Do the what if I still show up game. I use the term because did I not tell you that's where you will see the glory of God? Martha is repulsed by the idea of how embarrassing, but Jesus simply reminds her that she made a commitment to believe. So now she must act on that belief. This is another invitation to Martha. I can do this without you, Martha. I don't need to have them roll the stone away. But did I not tell you to believe? I am inviting you with your belief to partner with me in my power and my authority. And together we are going to create something that shows the glory of God. If you, Martha, want to see the glory of God, if you don't want to miss it, you must believe that I can still show up. So they do what Jesus says, and they roll this 2 to 3 ton stone away from the opening of the cave. And then Jesus prays. It's a simple prayer, but notice that it begins with gratitude, as if Lazarus had already returned. Continuing, verse 41, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. Jesus lifted up his eyes. Don't miss this little gem. This is where, when you start doing deep dives in original versions and Greek, that you can find things that you won't ever think of. I didn't. It says Jesus lifted his eyes toward heaven. That's the original Greek phrase. And in studying this very phrase, I learned it can simply mean that he went like this. He looked up. But you and I both know it's rarely so simplistic, right? It can literally mean that he removed from his vision the things of earth. A focal point change, right? What he sees, discerns clearly, now is heavenly minded. He removed from his vision the doubters, the expectations of everyone, their definition of love, and instead focused only on the purposes of the glory of God. And remember, Jesus says it. He prayed out loud for their benefit. And it just made me question, are we willing to pray out loud, even one-on-one with someone, for the sake of others having an encounter with God that they can't enter into themselves, so that others will grow in their faith and belief? Are we willing to get past that comfort level of, oh, I can't do that? And I know it's scary for a lot of people, but that would be my challenge. If Jesus said, I'm doing this so that others will believe, is there a time that you can step in out of that comfort zone and say, I'm going to pray out loud for you right here, right now, so that that other person has a chance to see the Son of God? 43. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to him, unbind him and let him go. Now we're coming in for a landing as this story closes. Jesus did not use his inside voice. He used what is described as the most demonstrative and most dramatic vocal display that anyone had ever heard to date. He's no longer being subtle in his miracle. The other times, here's some mud on your eye, go wash. Or, here, let me just pray for you. Or here, let me just touch you. Or here, go do this. He is demonstrative about this. He is expressing his authority. He is setting himself up. And, he's setting himself up for he knows that in not so many months, it's all going to go downhill. And the Jews are going to gain access, right? But he's also setting himself apart from the wizards and the mediums of those days. Because in that culture, a wizard or a medium would claim that they could do this, but they would mutter and whisper. They would mutter and whisper their incantations, whatever, so that they would not be held accountable to what they said their spell would do. Jesus is claiming boldly and clearly, Lazarus, come out. So once again, the soul-spoken word of Jesus, of God, are enough to bring life. Now notice that Jesus calls Lazarus by name. This isn't the time that John writes about in chapter 5, in verse 28, where it says all who were in their graves would hear his voice. You're with me? This was to intentionally limit the response of the dead from everyone coming out of their graves. He specifically called Lazarus and only Lazarus. So Lazarus comes shuffling out, barely able to talk or walk, I should say, due to the strips that are wrapped around him still. He still had his grave clothes. And one scholar said, he still had them because he's going to need them again. But compare that to the fact that Jesus left his grave clothes behind in the tomb. Jesus didn't need him again. And the final words of this story, Jesus says, unbind him and let him go. Those are the words I want to end on. There's so much to this, but man, those are the powerful words that I want to end on. Unbind him and let him go. Those same words are for you and me. Jesus is looking for those deep parts of our hearts and our souls and our minds, those places where there might be lies that we're chained to, fears that we're bound to, promises that were unmet, expectations that were unmet. You put your own, even now. And Jesus is saying, unbind him from that fear. Unbind him from that lie. Unbind him from that physical ailment. Unbind him from that insecurity. You fill in the blanks and let him go. Where do you need this resurrecting power of Jesus to say, unbind it and let it go? Because as this story reveals, where you invite Jesus is where there is life restored.